I spent 28 years climbing into ambulances to save strangers. I knew the weight of a defibrillator paddle. I knew the sound a man's chest makes when you bring him back from somewhere dark. I knew how to stay calm when every second was costing someone their life. But on a Tuesday evening in late February, standing in my own backyard in Fullerton with a garden hose in my hand and the last of the Adelaide sun going orange over the rooftops, I learned something that 28 years of emergency medicine never prepared me for. I learned what it feels like when the people who are supposed to love you most decide quietly and without any apparent guilt that you have become inconvenient. The object was in my jacket pocket. It had been there for 6 months, small and laminated, the size of a business card, but carrying the weight of every decision I had ever made about who I trusted and who I did not. I did not know yet that I would need it that afternoon. I thought I was just watering my lemon tree. I want to stop here for just a moment, before I go any further, because I am sitting here telling you something I have never said out loud to anyone outside the people who absolutely needed to hear it, and saying it is harder than I expected. So let me ask you something first. Where are you right now? What city? What part of the world? Drop it in the comments because I genuinely want to know who is out there listening to an old paramedic on a Tuesday night. And what time is it where you are? If it is late, if you cannot sleep and you found this somehow, I understand that feeling better than you might think. Hit the like button if any part of what I am saying is landing somewhere real for you. And subscribe, because there is a new story here every single day. Now let me get back to that Tuesday afternoon, because what happened next is something I still turn over in my mind when the house gets quiet. The van was white with a blue stripe running along its lower half. I noticed it pulling to the curb in front of my house on Fisher Street the way I notice most things, slowly and without showing that I noticed. 28 years of showing up to scenes before anyone knew what was happening teaches you to observe without announcing yourself. The van had the words Harborview Rest and Recovery Center printed on the passenger door in a clean, professional font. Below that, a street address in Henley Beach. I knew that address. I had known it for a long time, though not the way Elliot and Priscilla expected me to know it. 2 adults climbed out of the van. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, both wearing the kind of light blue uniforms that say medical adjacent without quite saying medical. They moved with the practiced calm of people who do this regularly. Clipboard held at a neutral angle, lanyards swinging slightly as they walked toward my front gate. They were not aggressive. They were not unkind. They were, if anything, entirely professional, and that professionalism was its own particular kind of cold. Elliot was standing at the gate. My son, 36 years old, broad-shouldered the way I was at his age, hair cut close on the sides the way he has worn it since his early 20s. He was looking at the ground. He did not look up when I turned toward the gate. He did not lift his eyes when the 2 uniformed adults walked past him. He simply stood there with his hands at his sides, and the fact that he could not meet my gaze told me more in 3 seconds than anything that came afterward. Priscilla was beside him. My daughter-in-law, 34 years old, polished in the particular way that Adelaide's inner eastern suburbs tend to produce, the kind of woman who coordinates her clothing without appearing to have tried. She was holding a beige folder with colored tabs running down the right side. She had clearly organized this folder. She had clearly organized everything about this afternoon, with the same methodical efficiency she brought to every project she considered worth her time. She looked directly at me. She did not hesitate. She said in English, with a voice that carried no tremor and no apology, "I signed the placement papers, Malcolm. It's safer this way. The house already has a buyer waiting." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. Not because it was loud, because it was quiet, because she said it the way you might say the car is filled with petrol or the reservation is confirmed. She said it like a decision that had already been made and simply needed to be communicated to its subject. She said it like I was not standing in my own garden, in the late afternoon light, holding a garden hose, with 30 years of mortgage payments and 2 decades of widowhood and an entire life's worth of decisions behind me. She said it like I was a piece of furniture that needed to be moved to make room for something she wanted more. I looked at Elliot. I waited. I have learned in my life that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a moment of crisis is to simply wait and give the other person room to be who they are. I waited for my son to say something, to correct her, to look up from the ground, to give me one word that told me he had not agreed to this, that he was here under some misapprehension, that there had been a miscommunication somewhere along the line that we could sort out right here in the front yard, with the lemon tree as our witness. He gave me silence. Elliot gave me the silence of a man who has made a choice he does not have the courage to defend out loud. I put the garden hose down. I folded it carefully onto the ground, the way you lay down a tool you intend to come back to. I dried my hands on the old towel I keep hanging from the back fence post, the blue one that has been there so long the color has gone mostly gray from the sun. I was aware of everything around me with the particular heightened clarity that I have only ever felt at emergency scenes, that state where your senses sharpen because something important is happening, and your body knows it even before your mind has fully caught up. I looked at the name on the side of the van one more time. Harborview Rest and Recovery Center, 42 Marlborough Street, Henley Beach. I almost smiled. I caught it before it reached my face because Priscilla was watching me, and I did not want to give her anything she could interpret or use. But there was something happening inside my chest that was not fear, and was not grief, and was not even anger. It was the very quiet and very specific feeling of a man who has just realized that the people trying to outmaneuver him have driven him directly to the one place where their plan would not survive, contact with reality. I said in a voice that I kept level and calm, "If that is what you both believe, I'll come quietly." And I walked to the van, and I got in, and the door closed behind me. My name is Malcolm Reeves. I am 57 years old. I live at 18 Fisher Street, Fullerton, South Australia, in a single-story brick house with a lemon tree in the backyard and a workshop in the shed where I repair old radios on evenings when the quiet gets too loud. I spent 28 years working as a paramedic and then as a medical logistics coordinator, which is a job title that sounds dry but means I was the person responsible for making sure that when an emergency happened anywhere in the metro region, the right people and the right equipment were in the right place. It is a job that teaches you, above almost anything else, to think several steps ahead, to plan for contingencies, to understand that the moment that looks like a crisis is usually something that started going wrong much earlier, and that the way you respond in the acute phase determines almost everything that comes after. I have been a widower for 11 years. My wife Claire died of a brain aneurysm on a Sunday morning in March. She was 46. She was in the kitchen making toast. I was in the backyard. By the time I heard her fall and reached her, I knew from the way she had fallen that the outcome had already been decided. But I did everything a paramedic is trained to do because that is what you do, and because she deserved every second of effort I had. The ambulance came. The paramedics did what I would have done. It was not enough. It is never something that stops being true, that it was not enough, but over 11 years you learn to carry it differently. Elliot was 25 when he lost his mother. He was living in a share house in the city and working his first real job. He came home in the days after, and I watched him grieve in the particular way that adult children grieve a parent. A little displaced, a little guilty about returning to their own lives, a little uncertain about who they were supposed to be, now that one of the two people who had always defined the world for them was gone. I did not push him. I let him find his own way to it. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps the distance he learned to live with in those years became the distance he operated from later, when it mattered more. Priscilla came into his life 4 years after Claire died. I noticed when Elliot first brought her to the house for dinner, the way she catalogued the room. Not obviously, not rudely, but I have spent too many years watching how people's eyes move when they are under stress or when they are making calculations, and I saw her eyes move across the bookshelves and the dining table and the framed photographs on the wall and the general condition of the house with the particular focus of someone who is not simply observing, but is appraising. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself that grief had made me suspicious of people who had not earned my suspicion. I told myself that Elliot seemed happy and that should be enough. It should have been. It was not. The house on Fisher Street has 4 rooms, a front sitting room where the light comes in at an angle in the morning that Claire always liked, a kitchen with yellow tiles that I have never replaced because they were there when we bought the house and they have a particular cheerfulness that I have come to depend on, 2 bedrooms, and the bathroom with the slightly crooked towel rail that I keep meaning to straighten and never do. The workshop in the backyard is mine in a way that the rest of the house is shared with memory. Out there among the soldering iron and the radio parts, and the smell of old electronics and machine oil, I am simply a man with a task in front of him, and that simplicity has kept me honest with myself through years when honesty was not always comfortable. The house is mine. It has been mine since 1991. The mortgage was paid in full 16 years ago. It represents, in the most literal material sense, everything Claire and I built together, every sacrifice and every overtime shift and every year of choosing the sensible option over the exciting one because we were building something that was supposed to last. After Claire died, the house became something more than property. It became the last physical container of the life we had made. Getting rid of it would not be letting go. It would be erasing. Priscilla understood this. I think she understood it from the first dinner. And I think, in the years that followed, she worked out very carefully that the house was the obstacle, and that the obstacle needed to be removed, and that the cleanest way to remove it was to remove me from the equation first. The conversation about simplifying my life had started approximately 2 years before that Tuesday afternoon. It began as suggestions, which is always how it begins. Have you thought about a smaller place, Malcolm? The garden must be a lot to manage on your own. There are some lovely retirement communities with real support systems. Not nursing homes, of course, nothing like that. Just somewhere with community, somewhere you would not be so isolated. I was not isolated. I had neighbors I knew by name and by history. I had 2 former colleagues from the ambulance service who came around on Thursday evenings for cards. I had Fiona, my older sister, a 20-minute drive away in Norwood, who rang every second day and came for Sunday lunch when her schedule allowed. I had the radios. I had the lemon tree. I was not isolated. I was simply quiet in a way that Priscilla apparently found unsettling, perhaps because a quiet man is a man who is listening, and a man who is listening cannot be as easily managed as a man who is distracted. The suggestions became proposals. There was a conversation, approximately 14 months ago, where Elliot sat across from me at the kitchen table with the expression of a man delivering a prepared speech and told me that a financial advisor he trusted had suggested it would make a great deal of sense to liquidate the property and move the proceeds into a managed account that Elliot and Priscilla could help oversee. For my own peace of mind, he said. So I would not have to worry. I had not been worrying. But I listened. I let him finish. And then I said very quietly that I would think about it. I did think about it. And what I thought was that my son had just proposed, with the language of financial planning, that I hand control of my life's principal asset to him and to a woman I did not entirely trust, on the basis that management on my behalf would give me peace of mind. I thought about Claire and what she would have said. I thought about what it actually meant to accept that proposal. And then I drove to an office on King William Street in the city, and I sat down with a woman named Nadine Whitaker and I told her everything, calmly and in detail, because 28 years of emergency medicine had taught me that you do not wait for the crisis to establish your protocols. That was 6 months before the Tuesday afternoon with the lemon tree. The laminated card in my jacket pocket was the result of that meeting. Nadine had drawn up an advance care directive, updated and formal, which named my sister Fiona as my designated contact for any medical or residential decision in the event that I was considered to require support. The directive was registered. The directive was current. The directive specifically excluded any authority being granted to Elliot or Priscilla Reeves without my explicit and separately verified consent. Nadine had a copy. Fiona had a copy. The relevant registry had a copy, and I had a laminated card in my jacket pocket because I am a man who learned from 28 years of managing emergencies that the document that saves you is the document you have with you, not the one sitting in a folder at home. I sat in the back of the Harborview van as it drove west through the suburbs toward Henley Beach, and I watched Adelaide go past the window. The light was still that particular late afternoon gold that happens in the last hour before the sun falls behind the hills to the west. The liquid ambers along Glen Osmond Road were catching it in a way that turned the leaves almost copper. I watched the streets, and I thought about Callum Mercer. Callum and I had worked together for a period in the early 2000s when I was still on the road, and he was finishing his medical training with a rotation through the emergency services network. He was careful, and he was good, and he had a tendency to second-guess himself in ways that occasionally slowed him down when speed was what the situation required. There had been an incident, the details of which are not relevant to this story, where a paperwork error in a patient handover had created a potential liability situation. The error was not mine. The error was Callum's, made in the particular distracted exhaustion of a long rotation. And I had understood immediately what the consequences would be for a trainee physician if it was attributed correctly. I submitted the paperwork in a way that absorbed the administrative responsibility into a systems error rather than a personal one. Callum never thanked me directly. Men in those situations rarely do. But we both knew. And when I saw his name on the clinic documents, months before that Tuesday, in the early stages of my own quiet investigation into what Priscilla was planning, I had understood that sometimes the world arranges things with a particular attentiveness to the people who have spent years doing the right thing when no one was watching. The van turned onto Marlborough Street. The clinic was set back from the road behind a low hedge and a gravel path, a single-story building with wide windows and a veranda running along the front. It looked nothing like the institutional facilities I had visited in my working life. It looked like a private hospital trying to feel like a home, which is exactly what it was, the kind of place that cost a significant amount per night and presented itself as care for adults navigating complex transitions. Priscilla had chosen it well, in the sense that it was hard to argue with on its surface. It would have been very difficult for me to object to being brought somewhere this pleasant-looking without sounding like exactly the kind of difficult, irrational, resistant older man she was building a case around. The two uniformed adults helped me out of the van with a courtesy that told me they had been briefed to expect someone who might be confused or resistant. I was neither. I walked up the gravel path and through the front door of Harborview Rest and Recovery Center with my hands in my pockets and the laminated card against my left palm, and I looked around the reception area, which smelled of eucalyptus oil and something faintly like chamomile, and I waited for what came next. Priscilla had followed in her own car. She arrived approximately 3 minutes after us and immediately positioned herself at the reception desk with her badge folder open and her voice in the particular register she used for situations she intended to control. She used words like transition and capacity and asset management and temporary arrangement, the vocabulary of someone who had researched how these admissions worked and wanted to demonstrate that she understood the process. The young woman at reception listened and typed and responded with the measured professionalism that good administrative staff develop as a kind of shield. And then Callum Mercer walked around the corner from the corridor to the left of the reception desk. He was wearing a collared shirt in pale gray, no coat, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was 54 years old and looked it, in the honest way that some men do, with the particular weight of experience sitting in the lines around his eyes. When he saw me, he did not react visibly. He was too professional for that, and I was grateful. What he did was stop, look at Priscilla, and say in a tone of complete administrative neutrality, "Thank you for the paperwork. We'll need everyone to complete our standard intake protocols before the evaluation begins. Mrs. Reeves, if you could come with Emma to our documentation room. Mr. Reeves, I'll show you to our assessment suite myself." Priscilla opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at me and then at Callum and then back at her folder. She had not expected the director of the clinic to personally involve himself in the intake. She regrouped quickly, because she always regrouped quickly, and said that she had already spoken with his administrative team and that the documents were complete. Callum looked at the folder and said, pleasantly and without any change in his expression. "We have our own intake documentation requirements. It is standard practice and necessary for our accreditation. Emma will go through everything with you." Then he turned to me and said, "Right this way, Mr. Reeves." I followed him down the corridor. The carpet was pale green. The lighting was warm rather than institutional. There were prints on the wall, Australian landscapes, the kind that suggest tranquility without demanding it. When we reached a door at the end of the corridor, Callum opened it and we stepped into a small sitting room with 2 chairs and a window looking out onto a garden. He closed the door behind us. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Malcolm." And I said, "Callum." He sat down. I sat down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms behind closed doors in well-built buildings tend to be quiet, a managed silence. Outside the window, a banksia was moving slightly in a late afternoon breeze coming off the sea. He said, "Tell me what is happening." And I told him. I told him all of it, calmly and in order, the way I have always told the things that matter, without drama and without omission. The suggestions about simplifying my life, the proposal about the managed account, the meeting with Nadine Whitaker, the documents I had prepared, the conversation I had overheard between Elliot and Priscilla approximately 3 months ago in the kitchen of their house on Wattle Grove, when they did not know I had arrived early and let myself in with my key, and stood in the hallway long enough to hear Priscilla say that if Malcolm would not agree voluntarily, they would need to find a way to establish that he was not coping independently. The specific word she used, not coping independently. Clinical language, the language of a woman who had already researched the pathways. Callum listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have current documentation of your advance care directive?" I took the laminated card from my jacket pocket and put it on the table between us. He picked it up. He read it. He put it down. He said, "Nadine Whitaker. I know her work. She is very thorough." Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "The documents Priscilla submitted have some issues I noticed immediately. The medical authorization is not current. The power of attorney they've attached appears to be a version that was superseded by changes to the relevant South Australian legislation 18 months ago. And there is something attached to the admission request that should never be attached to a clinical placement document." He paused. He said, "There is a property sales proposal from a real estate agency in the folder. It names this facility as the reason for the vendor's availability." I looked at the banksia moving in the garden outside. I said, "I see." He said, "I will need to follow our protocols. That means an independent medical evaluation, which you have the right to request, and which I am going to recommend regardless. It also means I am referring the documentation irregularities to our legal team tonight." I said, "That sounds correct." He stood up. He said, "I will have a room prepared for you. It is a comfortable room. You are not required to stay beyond the evaluation period, and given what I have just read, I suspect the evaluation will be straightforward." He paused again and said something that was not in his clinical register. He said quietly, "I remember what you did for me, Malcolm. I have never forgotten it." I said, "I did what was right." He nodded once. Then he opened the door and went back to do what needed to be done. I stayed in the chair for a moment longer. I looked at the garden. The banksia was still. The light outside was going to that deeper gold that comes right before Adelaide loses the sun entirely and the sky turns a particular shade of violet that I have always thought is one of the more beautiful things about living in this city. I thought about Claire. I thought about the yellow tiles in the kitchen on Fisher Street. I thought about the lemon tree that needed watering. I thought about Elliot standing at the gate looking at the ground, making the choice to stay silent, and I thought about how much it costs a father to look at his son and see clearly, for the first time, without any filter of hope or denial, what his son is actually capable of. The cost was real. I want to be honest about that. There are people who tell stories like this one and they make themselves sound as though they walked through the whole thing untouched, as though the betrayal slid off them like water off stone. That is not the truth. The truth is that I sat in that chair in a room in Henley Beach in the last of the Tuesday afternoon light, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the particular grief of a father who has looked at his child and understood something that cannot be ununderstood. Elliot was not a monster. Elliot was a man who had let someone he loved talk him into a terrible thing, slowly, over years, in the way that people who are not naturally cruel sometimes find themselves doing cruel things, because they stopped asking themselves whether what they were doing was right. That grief was real. It sat in my chest like something dense and cold, and it did not move when I told it to. But underneath it was the laminated card on the table. Underneath it was Nadine's careful handwriting and Fiona's phone number and 6 months of quiet preparation. Underneath it was Callum Mercer's voice saying, "I have never forgotten it." Underneath it was 28 years of knowing that the moment that looks like the worst moment is often the moment that turns everything toward the truth, if you were patient enough to prepare for it and steady enough to let it unfold the way it needed to unfold. I picked up the laminated card. I put it back in my pocket. I was not broken. I was not confused. I was not an old man who needed to be placed somewhere for his own peace of mind. I was a 57-year-old man who had spent his entire working life showing up to other people's worst moments and helping them find the path through. And this was my worst moment. And I had already found the path through. I had found it 6 months ago in an office on King William Street, sitting across from a woman named Nadine who had listened to everything I said and then said, "Let's make sure you're protected before any of this goes any further." Outside the window, the last of the Tuesday light folded itself over the roof of the clinic, and the garden went quiet and blue, and I stood up and went to find my room. The room was on the eastern side of the building, which meant the morning light would come in early. Someone had thought about that. The window looked onto a section of the garden where a large melaleuca grew close to the building, its paper bark pale in the early darkness, its branches making small sounds against the glass when the sea breeze picked up. There was a single bed with a white cover, a wooden chair, a small writing desk, and a lamp with a warm filament globe that gave the room the quality of light that Claire used to call honest light, meaning you could see what was actually there without either the harshness of overhead fluorescence or the flattery of something too dim. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes. I am not a man who decorates his inner states with extensive language, even to himself. What I was feeling I categorized as follows. I was tired in the specific way that comes from sustained alertness, the kind of tiredness you feel after a long shift where nothing catastrophic happened, but your body was ready for catastrophe every moment, and has used up something real in that readiness. I was clear in my thinking. I was sad in a way that was sitting quietly in the background, patient and unhurried. The kind of sadness that knows it will be attended to in time and does not demand immediate attention. I thought about dinner. I was genuinely hungry. This surprised me slightly, that I could be hungry in the middle of everything, but bodies are practical things and mine had always been more practical than poetic. A staff member knocked and brought a tray, lamb with roasted vegetables and a small pot of tea. I ate slowly and looked out the window at the melaleuca, and I let my mind do what it needed to do, which is to say, I let it go back and review the sequence of events that had led to this room, the way I would review a call-out after returning to the station, looking for what had gone right and what had gone wrong and what I would do differently if I had to do it again. I had done very little wrong. That was the honest conclusion. The meeting with Nadine had been timely. The documents had been prepared correctly. Fiona had been briefed. The laminated card had been in my pocket. The weakest point in my preparation had been Callum, not because I was unsure of him, but because his involvement depended on the coincidence, if coincidence is the right word, of Priscilla choosing his facility, which I had not arranged and had no way to arrange. If she had chosen a different clinic, the intake director would not have been someone who owed me a debt of professional gratitude. The documents would still have been irregular. The evaluation would still have been required. But the speed with which Callum identified the problem and moved on it would not have been available to me. I filed that observation. The plan had worked not because it was perfect, but because it was sound, and a sound plan accommodates the unanticipated better than a perfect one that relies on everything going exactly as imagined. My phone was on the desk. I had been permitted to keep it. This was a recovery center for adults, not a secure facility, and I was there under circumstances that were about to become significantly clearer to everyone involved. I picked up the phone and called Fiona. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. Fiona is 62 years old and has been a secondary school teacher of English literature for 3 decades, which means she has a particular quality of patience that most people mistake for calm, but which is actually attention. She listens the way readers of literature listen, for what is not said as much as for what is said. "Are you all right?" she said. Not a question. A temperature check. "I am at the clinic," I said. "Harborview." A pause. Then, "Callum Mercer's clinic." "Yes." Another pause. Shorter. "How did that go?" "It went as well as it could have," I said. "He has the documents. He has seen what is in the folder. His legal team is involved tonight." "And Priscilla?" "She was here for the intake. She will have left by now." Fiona was quiet for a moment. I could hear the particular background silence of her house in Norwood, the old weatherboard place she has lived in for 20 years, a silence that has its own texture. Then she said, "I'll get my folder together tonight. I can be there tomorrow morning if you need me." I said, "Not tonight. Tomorrow is fine. I will ring you in the morning after I have spoken to Callum." "Malcolm." Her voice changed register very slightly, in the way that only happens between people who have known each other for more than half a century. "Are you actually all right?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "I am sad about Elliot, but I am not surprised, and I am not afraid, and I am not confused or incapacitated, whatever documentation they put together to suggest otherwise." I paused. "The lemon tree is going to need water." She made a sound that was the nearest Fiona gets to a laugh when things are not funny. Then she said, "I will go tomorrow morning before I come to you." We said good night. I put the phone down. I lay back on the bed with my shoes still on and looked at the ceiling and let myself think about Elliot. Not the Elliot of the last 2 years, but the Elliot I had raised, the one who at 9 years old had rescued a magpie with a damaged wing from the back fence and built a small enclosure for it out of old wire and cardboard, and who had sat with it every evening for 3 weeks, patiently, feeding it small pieces of mince from a spoon, until one morning it had simply healed enough and flown away, and Elliot had stood at the kitchen door watching it go with an expression that was equal parts grief, and something that I recognized even then as the particular satisfaction of having done something right, even when it cost you something. That boy was still in there somewhere. I did not know if I could reach him anymore, but I had not yet decided he was unreachable. I closed my eyes. I slept better than I had any right to. In the morning, Callum came to my room at 7:30. He knocked properly and waited until I said, "Come in." He was carrying 2 cups of coffee in the white mugs that the clinic used, and he sat in the wooden chair and put one of the mugs on the desk beside me and held the other in both hands in the way that men of a certain age hold a morning cup of coffee, like it is partly warmth and partly ballast. He said, "Our legal team reviewed the folder last night. I want to tell you what they found." I said, "All right," he said. "The medical authorization for your placement was signed by a GP whose name appears on our approved practitioner list. However, the assessment they used to support the authorization was conducted 11 months ago in a general health check context, with no specific evaluation of capacity or independent living function. It is not a valid basis for a placement recommendation." I said, "I see." He said, "The power of attorney document naming Elliot Reeves as your authorized representative was drawn from a template that was compliant with South Australian legislation until it was amended 18 months ago. The current version requires a different witnessing arrangement and a specific attestation clause that is absent from this document. It is not valid." I said, "I understand." He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, The third document in the folder is the one that I think you need to hear about very carefully. He looked up at me. It is a conditional sale agreement for the property at 18 Fisher Street, Fullerton, pending vacant possession. It is dated 6 weeks ago. It is conditional on what it describes as the resolution of the current occupancy situation, which it defines as your relocation to a residential care or supported living environment. The room was quiet for a moment. The melaleuca outside the window was brighter in the morning light, its bark a pale sandy gold. I said, "So the sale was already negotiated." Callum said, "It appears so. Our legal team's view, and this is preliminary, is that attaching a property sale agreement to a clinical placement request as a supporting document represents a significant misuse of the placement process. They have referred it to the body that oversees residential placement practices and the relevant regulatory office." I said, "What happens now on the clinic's side?" He said, "I have already initiated the independent evaluation. It will be conducted today by one of our senior clinicians who has no prior knowledge of your case or your family. It will take approximately 2 hours. The outcome, if it confirms what I already know from speaking with you yesterday evening, will be formally documented and registered. That document will be very significant if this matter proceeds to any formal process." I said, "And Priscilla?" He said, "I have not been in contact with her since last night. My administrative team told her that the evaluation would take 2 to 3 days. She accepted that." I looked at him. He looked back at me. Something passed between us that was not quite satisfaction and was not quite friendship, but was something in the region of the particular recognition that passes between two people who have both navigated the places where professional duty and personal integrity occasionally require you to do a harder thing than the easier thing available to you. I said, "Thank you, Callum." He said, "Don't mention it." And the way he said it told me that he had been waiting 11 years for a chance to use those exact words in exactly this context. He left me to my coffee. I sat at the desk and looked out at the melaleuca and thought about Priscilla. I want to be precise about this. I did not hate her. I am not certain I was even angry at her in the simple, direct way that word usually implies. What I felt when I thought about Priscilla was something more clinical. The same detached attention I used to give to the behavioral profile of someone presenting at an emergency scene in a way that did not match the situation. There was something in Priscilla that had always been calibrating. Always measuring, always assessing what she was working with and what it could be turned into. I had seen it from the first dinner. I had explained it away because she was Elliot's choice, and Elliot's happiness mattered to me more than my own unease. I had overlooked small things because I love my son. I had given the benefit of the doubt through the suggestions, and then the proposals, and then the conversation about the managed account, because I kept believing at each stage that the next step would not come, that this was the outer limit of what she was willing to do. I was wrong each time. Not because I was naive, but because I was a father, and a father's capacity for hope on behalf of his children is one of the more functional kinds of blindness there is. The blindness was gone now. I had removed it myself, deliberately, in the office on King William Street, when I sat across from Nadine and said out loud for the first time, "I believe my son's wife is planning to use clinical placement as a mechanism to take my home from me." Saying it out loud to another person had been the important step, because until you say a thing out loud to another person, some part of you is still negotiating with the possibility that you are imagining it. Once you say it out loud, and someone else receives it without flinching and begins writing it down, it is real in a way it was not before. Nadine had not flinched, she had listened, and then she had said, "Tell me everything you have observed, in order, from the beginning." And I had told her, in the same way I was used to giving a patient handover, sequenced and specific, and without editorializing. And she had made notes and asked precise follow-up questions, and at the end she had said, "Right, let's build you a structure that protects you regardless of what they try." The structure had worked. It was working right now, while I sat in a clinic room in Henley Beach drinking coffee and waiting for an evaluation I did not need because I was not incapacitated and had never been incapacitated, while on the other side of the city, Priscilla Reeves believed she had done the hardest part and was probably already discussing paint colors for the Fisher Street kitchen. I thought about Elliot. I thought about the magpie. I thought about the silence at the gate. The evaluation was conducted at 10 o'clock by a woman named Dr. Sasha Patel, who was approximately 40 years old and had the particular quality of efficient compassion that the best clinicians develop. She asked me about my daily routine, my medication, my social connections, my financial management, my sense of the future. She administered a standard cognitive screen. She asked me to describe my living situation and my reasons for my current presentation. I described everything accurately and without embellishment. She took notes. She asked a few follow-up questions. The whole process took 1 hour and 40 minutes rather than 2 hours. When it was complete, she said, "I will have my documentation ready by this afternoon." She paused and said with a small shift in register, "I want you to know that what I have observed today is consistent with a healthy, oriented adult with full capacity for autonomous decision-making." She paused again. "That will be stated very clearly in my report." I thanked her. She left. I went to the dining room and had lunch, chicken and salad and a glass of cold water. The other residents I could see were various ages, various presentations. One man of roughly my age was doing a crossword at a corner table with the focused pleasure of someone who has found the right task for the morning. A woman was knitting near the window. The room had the particular atmosphere of a place that is genuinely trying to be something other than institutional and is mostly succeeding. I thought about Fiona arriving with her folder, her small, careful folder with the updated directive and the supporting documents and the assessment records that Nadine had recommended she obtain and keep, the records from my GP of the past 12 months showing routine health maintenance and no concerns about function or capacity. Fiona had organized that folder with the same quiet thoroughness she had brought to everything in her life. She had not told me she was putting it together until it was complete. When she showed it to me, she had simply put it on my kitchen table during a Sunday lunch and said, "I thought this might be useful to have." That was Fiona. Preparation without ceremony. I went back to my room after lunch and sat in the chair and thought about what was happening on Wattle Grove. Priscilla would still believe she had time. She would believe the evaluation was ongoing and the process was moving in the direction she had designed it to move. She would be sitting with her reasonable exterior in place, and her plans in motion, and her beige folder in a neat stack somewhere in the house on Wattle Grove, with its white walls, and its engineered timber floors, and its kitchen island that cost more than my car. She would be planning. She would be managing. She was very good at managing. She did not know that her folder was now with a legal team. She did not know that the clinic's regulatory referral had already been submitted. She did not know that Nadine Whitaker had been contacted by Callum's team that morning and had begun preparing the documentation on her end. She did not know that the evaluation report that would be ready by that afternoon would state, clearly and on the record, that Malcolm Reeves was a healthy, oriented adult with full capacity for autonomous decision-making. She did not know that the structure she had tried to use against me had already been turned into the case against her. I want to take a moment here, before I go on to tell you what happened in the days that followed, because I want to say something directly to you, wherever you are, and whatever time it is where you are. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments because I genuinely read them, every single one. And if it is late, if this is the part of the night where the house has gone quiet and you are alone with your thoughts, tell me that too. There is always someone watching at an hour like that who found something they needed to find. Leave a like if this story is sitting with you in some real way. Subscribe if you want to know what happened when the moment finally came. There is a new story here every day. Now let me tell you about Fiona, because she deserves to be in this story properly, and because what she did matters as much as anything else. Fiona arrived the following morning at 9:15. She had driven from Norwood, and she had watered the lemon tree before she came, which she told me about while standing in the doorway of my clinic room, still carrying her car keys in one hand and her small folder in the other. She was wearing a pale linen jacket that I recognized as something she had owned for a long time, and she looked, as she always looks, like a woman who has organized her inner life sufficiently that very little from the outside disturbs it. She sat in the wooden chair. I sat on the bed. She put the folder on the desk and left it closed. She said, "How are you, Malcolm, honestly?" I said, "I am sad about Elliot. I said that to you on the phone." She said, "I know. I am asking how sad." I thought about it. I said, "The kind of sad that you do not try to talk yourself out of because it is correct. He made a choice. I watched him make it. That is simply what it is." She nodded. She looked at the closed folder and then at me and then back at the folder. She said, "I rang Nadine this morning. She told me Callum's team was in contact yesterday. She says the regulatory referral is significant." I said, "That is my understanding as well." She said, "What do you want to happen, Malcolm?" "Not to them. What do you want to have happen?" "For yourself." I thought about the yellow tiles in the kitchen, the workshop in the shed, the lemon tree, the particular angle of the morning light through the front window that Claire used to sit beside with her tea. I said, "I want to go home." She said, "Then that is what we are going to make happen." Nadine arrived at the clinic at 11 o'clock. She had driven from the city. She sat with me and with Callum, and she reviewed Dr. Patel's evaluation report, which had been completed and was already in the system. She reviewed the legal team's findings. She reviewed the regulatory referral. She spread her own documents on the table beside Fiona's folder and the laminated card, and together they made a picture that was, in the most important sense, complete. Nadine said, looking at the table, "The placement itself is void. The authorization was invalid. The power of attorney was invalid. The evaluation confirms capacity. The clinic's legal referral establishes the misuse of placement process." She looked at me. "The only thing remaining, from a documentation standpoint, is to ensure that the relevant people are formally notified and that the property situation is addressed." Callum said, "We have a unit in this facility that manages protections for adult residents. They work with the relevant statutory body for adult safeguarding. We can initiate a notification today." Fiona said, "What does that mean practically?" Callum said, "It means that a formal notification will be sent to the Adult Safeguarding Office identifying what has been submitted in support of this placement and requesting an investigation into whether an attempt was made to use a clinical placement to access property without the knowledge or consent of the property owner." He paused. "That office has the authority to refer the matter to the relevant legal body, which can issue interim orders preventing the sale or transfer of the property pending investigation." Nadine said, "That is consistent with what I would recommend. I can file a parallel motion on Malcolm's behalf today." I sat at the table and looked at the laminated card and at Fiona's folder and at the documents that Nadine had laid out, and I thought, not for the first time, about what it means to prepare for something you hope will never be necessary. Claire used to say that the best insurance policy is the one you hope to never use. She was talking about the literal kind when she said it, but it applies to all the kinds. 6 months ago I had sat in Nadine's office and told her everything, and she had helped me build a structure. The structure was not a weapon. I did not build it to destroy anyone. I built it because I had been watching the shape of what was coming for long enough to know that when it arrived, having done nothing would not be a neutral act. It would be a surrender. And I am not, in any area of my life, a man who surrenders things he should protect without exhausting every proper avenue first. I said, "Please proceed." Nadine made a call. Callum spoke to his unit. Documents moved through systems with the particular efficiency that happens when everything is correctly prepared and the procedures are being followed by people who know what they are doing. Fiona sat beside me and did not reach for my hand or offer comfort in words because she knows me well enough to know that what I needed in that moment was presence, not gesture. By early afternoon, the regulatory referral was filed. The adult safeguarding notification was submitted. Nadine's motion was prepared and would be filed with the tribunal that afternoon. The independent evaluation was on record. The laminated card had done its work. Somewhere on the other side of the city, on Wattle Grove in Unley, in a house with white walls and engineered timber floors, Priscilla Reeves was going about her afternoon with the confidence of someone who believes they have already won. She had not yet heard the knock on the door. I want to stop right here before we get to what happened next, because what comes in the next part of this story is something I need to make sure you are ready for. Before I go on, tell me where you are. What city? What country? What part of the world? Drop it in the comments below and let me know who is in this with me. And if someone comes to mind as you listen to this, someone you know who has been through something where the people they trusted tried to use that trust as a weapon, share this with them. Maybe what they need is simply to hear that these things can be survived and that the truth has a way of arriving at the right address at the right time. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a new story here every single day. And let me take you to Wattle Grove. There is a particular kind of silence that a house produces when it knows something has gone wrong inside it. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a man says when he has gotten too old and too quiet and started listening to furniture. But I have lived in this house in Fullerton for longer than some of my neighbors have been alive, and I know its sounds the way I know the sounds of my own breathing, the particular settle of the foundation in the heat of an Adelaide afternoon, the way the workshop door catches slightly before it opens all the way, the specific creak of the third board from the left in the kitchen hallway that Claire always said she was going to get fixed, and never did, because she secretly liked that it announced her in the night when one of us could not sleep and got up for water. When Fiona drove me home from Harborview on that Thursday afternoon, the house was silent in the way it is silent when I have been away, and it has been waiting. Fiona pulled into the driveway, and we sat for a moment before getting out, the way you do when you need the car to be a room for just a little longer. She did not say anything immediately, and neither did I. The lemon tree was visible from the passenger window, and it was drooping slightly in the way it droops when it has gone too many days without water. She had watered it that morning, she had told me, but a few days without attention had done what it always does. I got out of the car and walked directly to the tap at the side of the house and uncoiled the hose and began watering the tree the same way I had been doing when all of this started. There is something in that deliberate repetition that I needed. I needed to be standing in my own backyard with the hose in my hands, doing the thing I was doing when they came, and to feel the ground under my feet and the late afternoon heat on my face, and to know, with the specific certainty of a man standing in his own garden, that I was exactly where I belonged. Fiona stood on the small back veranda and watched me without saying anything. After a few minutes she went inside, and I heard the kettle go on. I want to tell you about the days between leaving the clinic and the morning that changed things at Wattle Grove. I want to tell you about them specifically because I think the time between the preparation and the conclusion is the part of these stories that people most often get wrong when they tell them. People want to make it linear. They want to say that once the documents were in order and the referrals were filed, there was a clean line from that moment to the morning. The officials knocked on Elliot and Priscilla's door. But it was not like that. It was 3 days of living in my house, with the knowledge of what was happening and the knowledge of what was coming, and those 3 days were their own specific experience. I slept in my own bed the first night back. That sounds like a simple thing. It was not a simple thing. The house had been quietly invaded in my absence. Not physically. No one had entered. But knowledge changes the rooms you move through. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the yellow tiles and thought about Priscilla saying the house already has a buyer, waiting in the same flat voice she would use to report a weather forecast. I walked into the front sitting room and looked at the chair by the window where Claire used to sit with her tea in the mornings, and I thought about what it means to love a place so completely that the people who never understood why you loved it believe the love itself is evidence of incapacity. There is something clarifying about sleeping in your own bed after sleeping somewhere that is not your own bed. It is not dramatic. It is simply the particular clarity of ordinary things when they have briefly been taken away and then returned. Now, before I go on, I need to stop for just one moment. I realize I have been taking you deep into something that does not get lighter for a while, and I want to check in. Where are you right now? What city? What state? Drop it in the comments because I genuinely read every single one, and I want to know who is out there staying with me through this. Is it late where you are? Is this the kind of night where you found this without quite knowing why you needed it? If it is, I understand. There is always someone watching at an hour like that, and I am glad you are here. Leave a like if this story is hitting somewhere real for you. Subscribe, because there is a new story on this channel every single day. Now let me keep going, because the next 3 days were something I need to tell you about carefully. The second thing I did on the morning after I came home, after I watered the tree and drank my first coffee at the kitchen table, was sit down with a notebook and write out the complete sequence of events from the Tuesday afternoon on. Not because I did not remember them, because I have spent 28 years in emergency medicine and medical logistics, and I know that the clearest way to understand what has happened and what needs to happen next is to write it down in sequence, in plain language, without embellishment, so that the pattern is visible. I wrote for approximately 2 hours. I wrote everything, the conversation about simplifying my life, the first time that phrase appeared and when, and in what context, the proposal about the managed account, the meeting with Nadine, the decision to update the advanced care directive and name Fiona as my contact, the specific conversation I had overheard in Elliot and Priscilla's kitchen 3 months prior, the Tuesday afternoon with the van and the lemon tree, the intake at Harborview, the conversation with Callum, Dr. Patel's evaluation, Callum's findings about the documents, the referral to the regulatory body, the parallel motion that Nadine had filed. When I finished, I read it back through from the beginning without stopping. It took 40 minutes. When I reached the end, I sat for a moment, and then I did something I have not told many people about. I took the notebook to the workshop, and I sat in the old chair by the bench where I do my radio work, and I read the whole thing through again, this time in the space where I have always done my clearest thinking. The workshop smells like solder and machine oil and old electronics and something underneath all of that I cannot name. The specific accumulation of years of working with your hands in one place. It is the smell of effort and patience, and the particular satisfaction of taking something broken and making it work again. I read my notes in that smell, and I understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, that what Priscilla had been building for 2 years was not an impulsive act of greed. It was a patient and methodical project, and that the most important thing I could do in the days remaining before the tribunal notification was delivered was to make certain that my own position was as complete and documented as hers. Nadine had told me, on that Thursday at the clinic, that the tribunal process would move within 72 hours. The interim order suspending any property transactions would be the first action. That would be delivered to the address on Wattle Grove by officers from the court, accompanied by a representative from the Adult Safeguarding Unit. I had asked her to describe the process in detail, and she had done so, with a particular thoroughness that I had come to appreciate about her. She explained who would come. She explained what they would carry. She explained that the process was designed to be conducted without drama or physical confrontation, that these officials were trained to handle complex family situations with the kind of calm professionalism that was meant to protect everyone involved, including the family members being notified. I had listened to all of this, and I had asked one specific question. I asked whether Elliot would be present when it happened. Nadine said that the notification was addressed to both occupants of the residence and that both would be served. She said this in a voice that was entirely neutral. She was not delivering satisfaction. She was describing a process. I thanked her. I meant it. I want to be clear about something here because I think it matters. In the 2 years that the situation with Priscilla had been developing, and in the 4 days that I spent at Harborview, and in the days I spent at home waiting for the tribunal process to complete, at no point did I want to hurt Elliot. I want to be clear about the distinction. What Priscilla did was calculated and deliberate. What Elliot did was something different. He made choices. He made choices I cannot defend or excuse. But the choices he made were the choices of a man who had been slowly and carefully worked on by someone who understood exactly how to work on him. He was afraid. He was under influence. He was not the same man who had stood in my kitchen at 25 years old and cried over his mother in a way that told me he understood what real loss was. What I wanted for Elliot was not punishment. What I wanted for Elliot was the truth. Because in my experience, a man who is living inside a constructed reality, a reality that someone else built and maintains and repairs whenever it begins to crack, cannot find his way out of it without the structure being removed. The truth arriving at Wattle Grove was not an attack on my son. It was the removal of the structure that had been keeping him away from his own judgment. Whether he would be able to use his own judgment once it was returned to him was a question I could not answer. That was for Elliot to answer, and I was prepared for any answer he might give. The second night home I had dinner with Fiona. She had gone back to Norwood that first afternoon after we had tea together, and she had been back at work. Retired, but not idle in the way that some retired teachers are not idle. She drove over on Friday evening and brought a roast chicken from the place on Unley Road that she has been getting roast chickens from for decades, and we ate at the kitchen table without the television, and we talked for a long time about things that were not related to any of what was happening. We talked about the garden. We talked about a book she was reading. We talked about a former student of hers who had recently published something that Fiona was proud of in the quiet way she is proud of former students. The way that suggests she always knew they had it in them, but she is genuinely delighted that they found it themselves. We talked about the radio I was currently working on in the workshop, a 1960s portable, that someone had brought to me through the network of people who seem to know that I do this work, with a capacitor problem that was interesting in the specific way that a problem is interesting when it requires careful thought rather than simply new parts. We did not talk about Elliot or Priscilla or the tribunal until after dinner, when we were washing up in the kitchen together the way we have washed up after meals in various kitchens for our entire adult lives, one washing and one drying. Then Fiona said, without looking at me, drying a plate with the particular thoroughness she brings to everything, "How are you going to feel about it?" On the morning. I handed her the next plate. I thought about how to answer. I said, "Steady." She considered this. She put the dried plate in the cupboard and took the next one. She said, "Not relieved." I said, "Relieved will come later. On the morning I think I will feel steady." She said, "I think that is right." We finished the washing up, and then we sat in the front sitting room with tea, which we do, and she stayed until about 9 in the evening, and then drove home to Norwood, and I sat in Claire's chair by the window and listened to the house settling in the heat, and did not think about the morning because I had thought everything about the morning that I needed to think, and what was required now was simply to wait. The third day, Saturday, I spent almost entirely in the workshop. The radio with the capacitor problem was on the bench. I worked on it through the morning and into the early afternoon with the kind of focused attention that clears the rest of the mind of everything that is not the task. This is what the workshop has always been for me, a place where the specific demands of a specific problem occupy the foreground completely, and whatever else is happening in my life retreats to the background where it can be felt rather than thought about. I replaced the capacitor. I tested the circuit. I turned the radio on. After a moment of static, a voice came through the speaker with that particular warm crackle that old radios have when they are working as they were designed to work, a quality of sound that is nothing like the clarity of modern speakers, but which carries in it something that clarity does not, the sense of something being transmitted across distance against resistance, arriving imperfect but alive. I sat back in the chair and listened to whatever was on, and I thought about Callum saying, "I have never forgotten it," and about Nadine saying, "Let us build you a structure," and about Fiona saying, "Steady," and I thought about what it means to have spent a life doing things quietly and correctly when no one was particularly watching, not out of virtue in any performed sense, but simply because there is no way to live with yourself if you are not honest with the world and with the people in it. The notification at Wattle Grove was scheduled for the Saturday morning. By the time I was sitting in the workshop with the radio, it had been delivered for approximately 3 hours. I did not know specifically what had happened inside that house when the knock came. I would learn some of it later, from different sources, in the piecemeal way that the details of things always arrive after the fact, filtered through different perceptions and different states of distress. But I knew that it had happened, and I sat in the workshop with the radio murmuring in its warm old way, and I let the knowledge of it settle into me without trying to shape it into anything more than what it was. What it was the truth arriving at the right address. And that was enough for the moment. Now let me tell you what I learned about that morning at Wattle Grove, and how I learned it, because the specific details matter to the specific understanding of what had been built and how it came down. The 2 court officers arrived at Wattle Grove just before 9 in the morning. They were accompanied by Ruth Denholm, the representative from the Adult Safeguarding Unit, a woman who, as I would learn later, had spent more than 2 decades working in protective services for adults, a career that had given her the particular quality of unhurried steadiness that people in that role develop when they are good at it. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had done it many times. She had no interest in drama and no tolerance for obstruction. Priscilla answered the door. I know this because Elliot told me later, in the specific detail that comes from someone replaying a memory they have been over many times, that Priscilla was already up and dressed when the knock came, which was itself notable for a Saturday morning, and that she went to the door with the particular composed confidence that she always brought to unexpected situations. She was, by every account, entirely controlled in those first moments. She accepted the notification documents. She read them at the door without asking the officials inside. She did not raise her voice. She did not appear visibly flustered. Then she asked, in the careful language of someone who has done some research, what specific authority authorized this notification. Ruth Denholm explained the tribunal reference and the regulatory referral from the Harborview legal team. She named the specific bodies. She was patient and clear. She had encountered the question before. Priscilla said that the documents supporting the placement at Harborview had been prepared correctly, and that she believed there had been some misunderstanding about the scope of the Advance Care Directive. Ruth Denholm said that the evaluation conducted at Harborview had confirmed that the named person had full capacity for autonomous decision-making and that the Advance Care Directive had been prepared correctly and registered correctly, and that the document Priscilla had presented at the intake had been drawn from a superseded template. Priscilla said she would need to speak to her legal advisor. Ruth Denholm said that was entirely her right and provided the contact information for the relevant offices. She also confirmed that the suspension of any property transactions related to the Fisher Street address was now in effect pending full review, and that any attempt to proceed with a sale would be subject to significant legal consequences. Elliot had come into the hallway sometime during this exchange. He had been in the kitchen, which was on the far side of the house, and he had heard the knock and had come to see what was happening with the particular alertness of a man who has been sleeping poorly for days. He stood in the hallway behind Priscilla and looked at the 2 officers and the woman from the safeguarding unit and at the documents in Priscilla's hands. He said, according to what he told me later, "What is going on?" Priscilla turned and said, with a voice that was still controlled, "There has been a misunderstanding with your father's documents. I am handling it." Ruth Denholm looked at Elliot with the specific kind of look that people in her profession develop. Not accusatory, but clear and attentive, and said, "Mr. Reeves, you may also want to review these documents. The notification is addressed to both occupants." Elliot took the notification from Priscilla, who surrendered it without comment, though what that particular surrender cost her I can only imagine. He read it standing in the hallway, and then he kept reading it. And then he read a specific section again. I know which section it was because he told me. He told me about the section that described, in the formal language of the regulatory referral, the finding that a conditional property sale agreement for a residential address in Fullerton had been attached to a clinical placement request as a supporting document, and that this constituted a misuse of the placement process in a manner that warranted investigation by the relevant adult safeguarding authority. He stood in the hallway of his house on Wattle Grove, and he read those words, and he was quiet for a long time. The officials left after confirming that everything had been received and providing the relevant reference numbers. The door closed, and then it was just Elliot and Priscilla in the hallway. I am going to tell you what happened between them in that hallway, not because I was there, but because Elliot told me, 2 days later, in my kitchen, with his hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold while he was talking. He told me in the careful, broken way that people tell things they are ashamed of, starting and stopping, going back to correct details that he had gotten slightly wrong, pausing when he reached moments that were still too raw to narrate smoothly. Elliot said to Priscilla, "There was a sale agreement attached to the placement documents." Priscilla said, "I attached it as context." He said, "Context." She said, "To demonstrate why the arrangement was in everyone's interest, including your father's. He does not need a large house in Fullerton on his own. The sale would have provided him with substantial financial security." He said, "He did not agree to the sale." She said, "He would have, in time. Once he was settled somewhere appropriate and could see the practical benefit." Elliot went quiet. He told me he stood there for a moment that felt very long and very specific, and that during that moment he understood something that he had been refusing to understand for a significant period of time. He said he could feel the shape of the thing he had refused to look at directly for 2 years, and that now he was looking at it, and it was exactly what it was, and what it was not complicated. It was simply that his wife had decided that his father's home should be available for investment and had put considerable effort into making that available, and that she had used a clinical placement process as the mechanism, and that she had not asked Malcolm Reeves whether he wanted any part of any of it. He said, "You attached a sale agreement to my father's commitment papers." She said, "Placement documents, not commitment papers. That language is inaccurate and unhelpful." He said, "Priscilla, you attached a sale agreement to the paperwork that put my father in a clinic." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It was practical. You know, this house has been affecting our capacity to move forward with the investment strategy." Elliot told me that when she said that, something that had been held in place for a long time in the particular way that structures are held in place by constant maintenance simply stopped being maintained. He said it was not dramatic. It was more like the specific exhaustion that comes when you have been holding something up for too long and you simply stop holding. He said, "I need to talk to my father." Priscilla said, "I would recommend you speak to the legal advisor first." He said, "I am going to talk to my father," and he left. Now, I need to pause right here for just a moment. What I just told you is something that Elliot shared with me in confidence, and I want to be clear that I am sharing it with you because I think the full picture matters. Not because I want you to judge him, because I want you to understand what it actually costs a person when the structure they have been living inside is dismantled. It is not simply about being wrong. It is about understanding that you have been somewhere you did not know you were, and that the distance from where you thought you were to where you actually were is a measurement you have to live with. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and your state in the comments, because I want to know who is staying with me through this part of the story. This is the part that most people do not tell because it is the complicated part, the part after the justice and before the peace. And if you are still here, I appreciate it more than you know. Subscribe if you have not already. New story every single day on this channel, and leave a like if this story is giving you something. Now let me keep going. Elliot called before he came. He called on my mobile, which rang while I was in the workshop, and when I saw his name on the screen, I sat for a moment before I answered. Then I answered. He said, "Dad, can I come over?" I said, "You can." He said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "I know." He came about 40 minutes later. He knocked on the front door, which he has not done in years, having always simply come in, and the knock told me more about where he was than anything he had said on the phone. I opened the door, and he was standing on the front step in a shirt that was not quite ironed and with the particular quality in his face of a man who has not slept and has been crying, and is not going to mention either of those things. I stepped back and let him in. I put the kettle on, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I let the silence be what it needed to be for a few minutes. The kettle came to the boil. I made tea. I put a cup in front of him and sat down across from him with my own cup, and I waited. He said, "I did not know about the sale agreement." I looked at him. I said, "Tell me what you did know." He put his hands around the cup and looked at them. He said, "I knew she was worried about the house. I knew she thought you would be better somewhere with more support. I thought she was just being practical." I said, "What did you think when they came with the van on Tuesday?" He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I thought it was the right thing. I told myself it was the right thing." He paused. "Priscilla said you had been saying things that worried her, that you had forgotten appointments, that you had been confused about some paperwork." I said, "What appointments?" He looked at me. He said, "She said you had missed a GP appointment. Twice." I said, "I'd changed one appointment because of a commitment with a colleague on Thursday evenings that I have had for 2 years. I rescheduled it the same day. The other one I kept." He was quiet. He said, "She showed me emails." I said, "From who?" He said, "From your GP's office, saying you had missed appointments." I said, "Elliot, have you ever called my GP's office directly and asked them about my attendance?" He did not say anything. I said, "Your wife is a very organized person. She manages communications very efficiently." I said this without any particular edge in my voice. It was a factual observation. He looked at me, and I watched the specific moment when a thing he had been refusing to see became visible. It was not a sudden shift. It was a very slow movement, like light changing in a room without anyone touching the switch, simply time passing and the angle changing, and what was in the room becoming clearer. He said, "She manages your GP appointments." I said, "She offered to. About 14 months ago, she said she had a system and it would reduce stress for everyone." I declined. I paused. She was disappointed. He sat with that. I sat with him, sitting with it. I did not add anything. I did not explain further. The specific shape of the thing that had been done was now in the room between us, and it did not need me to describe it because Elliot was a man of 36 years who had managed operations for a building company, which required him to understand exactly how paper trails could be constructed to tell a story that served a specific purpose. He understood what I was telling him without me saying it. He said, "Dad, I am." He stopped. He started again. He said, "I let this happen." I said, "You let yourself be managed. There is a difference." He said, "What is the difference?" I said, "The difference is whether you can see it now." He looked at me. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. He is his mother's son in that way, in the particular dignity of not managing your face when your face is telling the truth. I said, "I am not going to tell you this is all right, because it is not all right. You stood at that gate, Elliot. You were there. You did not say one word." He said, "I know." I said, "You need to know that I saw that, and I am going to remember it." He said, "I know." I said, "And you also need to know that I understand how you got there. I do not understand it the way you need me to understand it yet. That is going to take time. But I know who you were before all of this, and I know that person was not capable of standing at that gate without something having been done to him over a long period of time." He put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he took his hands down and looked at the table. I said, "You are going to have some very hard conversations in the next while. Some of them are not with me." He said, "I know." I said, "I am not telling you what to do. You are 36 years old, and you make your own decisions, and you will live with them." He said, "Yes." I said, "But whatever you decide with full knowledge of what I have just told you, not with a version of events that someone organized for you." He said, "Yes." We sat there for a while longer. The tea went cold. I made more. At some point, Elliot asked if he could see the Advanced Care Directive, the actual document. and I got it from the folder in the office and put it on the table, and he read it carefully. He read the sections about Fiona and about the conditions under which his own authority over any of my decisions would and would not be recognized. He read it the way you read something that tells you more about a person's internal life than any conversation could, because a document like that is made in solitude and in honesty, and it says exactly what the person actually believed at the moment they signed it. He said, "You made this 6 months ago." I said, "I made it when it became necessary." He said, "Before the van." I said, "Yes." He said, "You saw this coming." I said, "I saw a direction. I prepared for where the direction might lead." I paused. That is what 28 years of emergency medicine teaches you. You do not wait for the emergency to establish your protocols. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, very quietly, "She said you were confused." I said, "I know what she said." He said, "I should have called you." I said, "Yes." He said, "I should have called you and asked you directly." I said, "Yes." And then neither of us said anything for a while, and the house settled around us in the late afternoon with the particular sound that this house has made for the 34 years I have lived in it, and outside the window, the lemon tree stood in its corner of the garden, drinking in what it had been given, which is what it does. Elliot left before dinner. He did not ask if he could stay, and I did not invite him. What had been said was what needed to be said at that particular stage, and sitting together over a meal would have been a performance of something that was not yet ready to be performed. He stood at the front door with his jacket in his hand, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who is carrying something very heavy and knows he will be carrying it for a long time. He said, "I am sorry, Dad." I looked at him. I said, "I know you are." He said, "That is not the same as accepting it." I said, "No, it is not." He nodded. He left. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular quiet that follows the departure of a person who took a great deal of the room's emotional weight with them when they went. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner and ate at the table and listened to the radio, which was on the counter playing the same station it has been playing for years, and I let the evening be what it was. Later, after I had washed up and turned the lights down and was sitting in the front room with the lamp on, I took out my phone and called Fiona. She answered on the first ring. I said, "Elliot came today." She said, "How did it go?" I said, "As well as it could have." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Truly?" I said, "Truly. I am sad, and I am tired, and I am in my own house, so yes, I am all right." She said, "Good." And then, after a moment, she said, "Claire would be proud of you, Malcolm." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I hope so." We said good night. I sat in Claire's chair for a long time after that, in the lamplight, with the house quiet around me and the lemon tree outside in the dark of the garden, and I thought about what it means to build something and protect it, not just the physical something, but the human something, the relationships and the values and the specific quality of a life that has been lived honestly. I thought about the laminated card and what it had done. I thought about Nadine and Callum and Fiona, the 3 people who had helped me do correctly what needed to be done. I thought about Ruth Denholm and the 2 court officers arriving at Wattle Grove in the morning with no drama and no violence, and simply the weight of correct documentation and the authority of a system that, when used properly, works as it is supposed to work. And I thought about Elliot sitting at my kitchen table with his hands around a cold cup of tea, reading my advance care directive, and I thought that whatever happened next, whatever the next months brought, the most important thing that had happened was that my son was now in possession of the actual truth. What he did with it was his business. But the truth was with him now, and it could not be taken back. That is worth something. That is worth a great deal. Let me take you now to the period that followed, because the tribunal process and the legal consequences of what had been done deserve to be told properly, and because the shape of justice in these situations is not always what people imagine it will be, It is not a single dramatic moment. It is a series of processes that take the time they take, and what you do while they are taking their time is part of the story too. The interim order suspending any property transactions had been issued and served. The regulatory referral from Harborview had generated a formal investigation by the body that oversees residential placement practices in South Australia. Nadine was managing the parallel legal process on my behalf. The specific question before the relevant bodies was whether the clinical placement at Harborview had been sought in good faith for my benefit, or whether it had been sought as a mechanism to enable property transactions that I had not consented to and had not been consulted about. Nadine explained to me, in one of our regular conversations during that period, that the documentation in Priscilla's beg folder had done something that all the careful legal preparation in the world could not have done as efficiently. It had made the case obvious. The conditional sale agreement attached to the placement request was not a subtle manipulation buried in layers of complexity. It was sitting right there in the folder, stapled to the placement documents, with the property address and the buyer details and the reference to the vendor's availability pending resolution of the current occupancy situation. It was, Nadine said, the kind of document that speaks for itself in a way that requires very little additional interpretation. The overconfidence of it was its own kind of answer to the question of who had planned this and how carefully. A person who was more careful would not have included that document. A person who had less confidence in the outcome would not have included that document. Priscilla had included it because she had not imagined that the intake director of the clinic would be a person with the specific professional history with me that Callum Mercer had, and because she had not imagined that I would have a current advance care directive in my jacket pocket, and because she had not imagined that the 2 irregularities in her power of attorney document would be immediately visible to a legal team that reviewed intake paperwork as a matter of routine. She had planned carefully, in many respects. She had simply failed to plan for the possibility that I had also been planning. The investigation took the time it took. I am not going to give you a blow-by-blow account of every procedural step, because that is not what this story is about, and it is not what you came here to hear. What I will tell you is that the process was real and serious, and that the outcome, when it came, was clear. The placement request was deemed to have been improperly prepared and to have been submitted in circumstances that did not meet the requirements for an adult placement under the relevant South Australian provisions. The conditional sale agreement was flagged as evidence of an improper purpose. The matter was referred to the relevant legal authority for further action, which is where it remained at the time I am describing, and which is where some of these things spend a long time, because the law moves at the pace it moves. What happened immediately and practically was that the interim order became a permanent order pending final resolution. No one was selling my house. The power of attorney document was formally declared invalid. My advance care directive was affirmed and registered in the relevant system with the updated notation that confirmed Fiona as my sole authorized contact. And I went home to Fisher Street and continued my life, which is the most important part of this entire story. That I continued my life, not as if nothing had happened, because that would be dishonest, and I have already told you I am committed to honesty in this account, but with the specific quality of continuation that a person achieves when they have been through a thing and come out the other side carrying what needs to be carried, and setting down what does not. The mornings were the same. Coffee, the kitchen with the yellow tiles, the workshop in the afternoon, the lemon tree requiring water, the radio that now worked correctly and sat on the workshop bench, murmuring companionably while I worked. The Thursday evenings with my 2 former colleagues who came around for cards and had no idea anything dramatic had happened because I had not told them and did not intend to tell them. Because there are friendships that exist in a particular register, and that register does not require a full accounting of everything you have been through. The weeks passed. The legal processes continued at their own pace. Fiona came for Sunday lunch every week. Elliot called twice a week and came for dinner on the first Sunday of each month, which had always been our arrangement before all of this had started. Those dinners were not easy. They were not natural in the way they had been before. Because what had happened was, in the room with us, even when it was not being discussed, which is the truth about significant events between people, they do not disappear when the conversation moves on. They sit at the table. But Elliot was there, and he was there without Priscilla, who was not coming to Fisher Street and who I did not expect to see for a long time, if ever. And the dinners were what they were, which was two people with a complicated history between them, trying to find the thread of what they had always been to each other before the complicated history arrived. Some weeks, the thread was easier to find than others. I am going to tell you something now that I have not yet told anyone in the way I am about to tell it. I am going to tell you about a specific evening approximately 6 weeks after all of this. An evening when Elliot came for dinner and stayed late, and we were sitting in the front room after dinner with the lamp on, and he said something that I have been thinking about ever since. He said, "I think I have been afraid of you for a long time." I looked at him. I said, "Tell me what you mean by that." He said, "Not afraid of you, afraid of disappointing you, of not being what you expected." I said, "What did you expect me to expect?" He thought about it. He said, "You built things. You were good at your job. You were steady. Mum said you never lost your composure, that she had never once seen you lose your composure at a scene, no matter what was happening." And He stopped. He said, "I sell apartments for a development company, Dad. I am not building anything. I am selling things other people built." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Elliot, I did not build anything. I drove ambulances, and then I coordinated people who drove ambulances. I repaired broken radios in a shed. I grew a lemon tree that has mixed results." I said, "I maintained things, and I tried to maintain them correctly. That is all I have ever done." He was quiet. I said, "The fear you are describing, did Priscilla know about it?" He looked at the table. He said, "She talked about it a lot, about how much pressure I put on myself to meet a standard that I had imagined you required." I said, "Did she?" He said, "She was very good at knowing where things hurt." He said this in a voice that was not angry. It was the specific voice of someone who has recently understood something and is still in the early stages of carrying the understanding. I recognized it because it is the voice I had been using with myself for 2 months about Elliot's choices. We sat with that for a while. The lamp was on and the house was quiet, and outside the garden was dark, and the lemon tree was a shape against the fence. I said, "She was right that you put pressure on yourself. She was wrong about where the pressure came from." I paused. "Your mother and I wanted you to be happy and honest. That is all we ever wanted. Happy and honest is not a high standard. It is not a difficult standard. It is simply the standard that a person can live with." He said very quietly, "I have not been honest." I said, "No." He said, "I told myself I was protecting you. I believe that." I said, "I know you believed it." He said, "But that was not what it was." I said, "No, it was not." He said, "What do I do with that?" I said, "The same thing anyone does with a thing like that. You look at it, you accept that it is true, and you make a different decision next time." He said, "Is there going to be a next time?" I said, "There is always a next time. That is what time does. It keeps providing them." He almost smiled. It was the first time I had seen him come close to anything like a smile in 2 months, and it was small and sad, but it was there. I said, "You're going to be all right, Elliot." He said, "I am not sure about that yet." I said, "I know, but I am sure about it, and I have been reading people for 57 years, so consider the source." He did smile then, properly, briefly, and it was so close to the smile he had at 9 years old watching the magpie fly away that something happened in my chest that I was not prepared for. I looked at the lamp instead of at him for a moment, then I looked back, and we sat there in the front room with the quiet house around us, and the lamp between us and everything that had happened somewhere in the middle of the room. Not gone, never going to be gone, but present in the way that real things are present, as part of the structure of the life, rather than an obstacle standing in front of it. Let me tell you what I know now that I did not fully know before this happened. And then let me tell you about the lemon tree, because the lemon tree is the ending of this story, and it is the only ending this story was ever going to have. Stay with me. We are almost there. The justice in a situation like this one is not a single morning. It is not a knock on a door and a notification served and then a clean line drawn under everything that came before. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the stories people tell about situations like mine often skip the part where justice is slow and complicated and where the people involved have to keep living inside the slowness and the complication and doing the ordinary work of their lives while the formal processes complete themselves. Nadine rang me approximately 4 months after the Tuesday with the lemon tree to tell me that the regulatory body had completed its investigation and that the findings had been formally issued. She went through the findings with me in her precise, clear way, and I listened and took notes in the same notebook I had used on the morning after I came home from Harborview. The findings confirmed that the placement request had been submitted without adequate medical authorization, and that the authorization presented was not compliant with the current requirements. They confirmed that the power of attorney document was invalid. They confirmed that the inclusion of a conditional property sale agreement in the placement documentation constituted an improper use of the placement process. They referred the matter to the relevant legal authority with a recommendation for further action. And know that what you have built in your life, the relationships, the property, the values, the reputation, the specific quality of a life lived honestly, that cannot simply be taken from you. It can be attacked, it can be pressured, it can be subjected to manipulation and legal maneuver, and the particular cruelty of people who have decided that your autonomy is an obstacle, but it cannot simply be taken as long as you choose to protect it. And protecting it is your right, not just your legal right, which it absolutely is, but your human right, the right of a person who built something to maintain what they built for as long as they are capable of doing so. I am still capable. I demonstrated that at Harborview and in the months that followed, and in every morning since, when I have stood at the back door with my coffee and looked at the lemon tree and chosen to continue being exactly who I am. You are still capable. Remember that. And if you need to hear it from one more voice, from one more old man who has been where you are and came out the other side with his house and his dignity and his workshop and his tree, you are still capable, and you are not alone. And the truth, when it is built correctly and held patiently, arrives at the right address in its own time. I want to close this account with one final thing. A specific morning that happened about 6 months after the notification at Wattle Grove. In the early days of winter, when Adelaide gets cold enough at night that you need the heater on, and the mornings have a quality of still pale light, that is nothing like the golden light of summer, but which has its own particular beauty. I was in the kitchen making coffee, the same routine I have maintained for decades. The specific coffee I have used for years. The particular mocha pot that I bought to replace one that wore out about 8 years ago. The kitchen was warm from the heater. The yellow tiles were catching the morning light. My phone rang. It was Elliot. He said, "Dad, I just wanted to call." I said, "It is 7:30 in the morning, Elliot." He said, "I know, sorry. I have been awake for a while. I was just sitting here and I thought I would call." I said, "All right." He said, "I was thinking about something I wanted to say to you." I said, "Say it then." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know that I understand what you did. Not just the legal preparation and the document, but what you did by staying calm, by not making it bigger than it needed to be at every stage, by keeping the door open." He paused. "I know that was hard. I know it cost you something." I said, "Yes." He said, "I do not know if I would have been able to do that." I said, "You have not been doing it for 57 years. Give yourself some time." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, and his voice had something in it that I recognized as the voice he had at 9 years old, when he was trying to say something that mattered, and could not quite find the words, "I love you, Dad." I stood in the kitchen with the yellow tiles and the morning light coming through the window and the mocha pot finishing on the stove, and I said, "I love you too, Elliot." We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, about his work, and about a book Fiona had recommended to him, and about the lemon tree, which he had developed a genuine interest in since the afternoon he had watered it on that Sunday. Then we said goodbye, and I put the phone down and I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I poured my coffee, and I went to the back door, and I looked at the lemon tree. The morning was cold and still. The tree was there the way it is always there, holding itself in the pale winter light, patient and rooted and doing what it does. I drank my coffee. I thought about everything that had happened and everything that had cost what it cost, and everything that had held when it needed to hold. And I thought about the specific peace that a man feels when he has done what needed to be done correctly and honestly and without cruelty, and has come back to himself intact. It is not a triumphant peace. It is quieter than that. It is the peace of a man standing in his own garden on a cold morning with a warm cup of coffee, knowing exactly where he is and exactly who he is, and knowing that both of those things are still entirely his own. That is the only ending a story like this one ever really has. Not the exposure, not the legal findings, not the confrontation or the documents or the formal notifications. Those things happen, and they matter, and they are real. But the ending is this: the man still standing in his own garden, the tree still there, the house behind him still his, the morning entirely his own. Before I go, I have one last thing to ask of you, and it is the most important ask I will make in this whole account. If you stayed with me through every single word of this story, all the way from that Tuesday afternoon with the hose in my hand to this morning in my kitchen with Elliot on the phone, I want you to leave me one word in the comments. Just one word. The word is rooted. If you truly listened, you will understand exactly why I chose that word. Not roots in the ground, though that is part of it. Not the tree, though the tree is part of it too. Rooted in the sense of a man who knows where he stands and what he stands on, and who cannot be simply moved against his will because everything that matters about him goes down deeper than anyone trying to move him thought to look. That is what I was. That is what I remain. That is what I hope you are or can become. Leave rooted in the comments. Subscribe for daily stories. Hit the like button if this story gave you something worth keeping. Share it with someone who might need to hear that the truth holds up when you build it right and hold it patiently. From this old man on Fisher Street in Fullerton, South Australia, in his kitchen with the yellow tiles, and his workshop in the shed, and his lemon tree in the corner of the garden, and his coffee that is now going cold, while he finishes saying what he needed to say, good night. Good morning. Whatever time it is where you are, I am glad you were here. Take care of each other out there. Take care of the people you love. And take care of the roots.